Going back to the cynicism thing, why do you think it is that it's so prevalent? Because it's something that both of us, I think, rail against. Both of us have a particular distaste for people that are unreasonably cynical, and it's part of the reason that I ended up moving countries in an attempt to try and be around people who are less cynical. What is it that's so alluring about that cynical mindset?
I I don't I don't know what I hate more than cynicism. Maybe like, literal totalitarianism, but in terms of personality, I don't know what I hate more and what I'm more against because it's such an absurd premise that's so easily disprovable. Cynicism, as I understand it, not in the Greek philosophical sense, but this idea that like everything sucks, or don't get your hopes up, it's not going to work out. As long as you have one counterexample, the thesis is disproven. And you're telling me that like if people are like uh uh you know I agree that most comedians suck. I agree that most movies suck. I agree that most books suck. I agree that most podcasts suck, especially mine. None of them? Not one? There's no book that you read that you're a better person having read it. There's no movie you've seen where you're like, "Holy crap, I feel like I'm watching something from heaven." There's no song that you've ever heard that even when you hear it for the 20th time, it shakes your soul? None? And if you're that kind of person, that's on you. That means you are somehow guarded or damaged or something within. And I think there is an enormous amount of pressure. And from what you and I have talked about, it's, I guess, more prevalent in British culture than America. But there is a lot of pressure of, kind of just head down, go to the factory, do the work, don't hope for anything better. And it's just like, you don't have to become a king or a president or a CEO to improve, right? Not everyone has to be a fitness model to be in better shape, right? If you're someone who's 400 pounds, you can get down to 250. You're still a big dude, but think how much healthier you are, your clothes, mobility, walking up the stairs, quality of life in every way. Is that such an unreasonable goal? But for a cynic, it's like, what's the point? You're still fat. Well, yeah, you are, but come on, these are extremely different qualities of life. So I think it is a very non-rational, emotional perspective that tries to present itself as as if it's realistic and cool-headed. It's like, "Oh, you're naive. You're a Pollyanna." And like you pointed out, the point of this book is I'm not being hopeful in the sense of nothing bad happens. I'm not being hopeful in the sense of the bad guys aren't really that bad. The extent of the depravity I was on my buddy Dave Smith. He's a very failed comedian, his podcast. And it goes, if you read 90% of this book, you think it's the black pill
Correct.
because you're reading it and you're like,
That's what I mean. I'm like, okay, chapter 10 and we're still not here.
and you're like, I just one, example off the top of my head. I hope I get through without my voice breaking because I still read it and just it just haunts me to my core. Early in the 1920s, there were these children who were like homeless in Moscow, and they were like thieves, pickpockets. You're your kid living on the streets. You got to make do. So the Cheka come, the secret police round them up, and they take them to the cellar of the prison, and they start beating them and torturing them, and making them who are you working with? Who are your colleagues? Whatever the term they used, right? In your gang, they're kids. They don't. So they take them in the car and they drive him around. They go point out who you're, and at that point you're like, yeah, him, anyone. And then they took him back and they kept beating them. And you hear the other prisoners, like the adults, hearing these kids screaming, and these adult criminals were like, they were losing their minds just hearing the screams of the children as the children realized they were being returned to the cellar. So when you hear about so there's no whitewashing in this book of how bad it gets. But people have this idea that like there's no point in fighting because, it's inevitable that the bad guys are going to win. But they haven't. Like I'm here. If Hitler had his way, I'd be dead. If Hitler had his way, you'd be dead, right? Like, Britain was standing alone against Hitler for quite a while. Or you'd be a slave. I don't know what you'd be, whatever. Point being, this insistence that villainy always, why is it, this is the line I had, when thinking about this book. Why is it that the bad guys always get what they want? Why? I can't get what I want once? And when you put in those terms, it's like, yeah, you're right. And even if I can't, I'm just going to be like, too bad. So I don't think it's a coherent worldview. I think it's a very emotional response coached in the mask of rationality and realism. And I don't think it's realistic at all.
It's able to give people, it's a much more sort of pedestalized position to be in, right? If you say that everything's going to be bad, it feels like a well-researched, the critic always feels like the guy that's well-researched.
Yeah, right.
Right? As opposed to the person that's hopeful, because the person that's hopeful that things don't happen have, and maybe this is actually reflected in terms of our neurochemistry. Andrew Huberman taught me about this thing where if you tell someone that a movie is going to be really, really good, their dopamine release, even if it's as good as they expect it to be, is less. And if the movie is less good than they expected it to be, then they lose even more.
Sure.
So what you're doing is, by being the cynic, you're saving yourself from ever being the person that overpromises. So maybe reality does deliver the world better than you'd hoped. Well, brilliant. That's a bonus for you. And I'm just trying to keep everybody's feet on the ground. That seems like a noble cause.
Weird. Y'all so stupid. Why are y'all so stupid? Get better problems, I swear to God that y'all want them. Y'all so dumb. People so stupid. People so dumb. People so boo-hoo. Wah, wah, wah. Get better issues. We're gonna run out of tissues. It's so dumb.